Hello and welcome. Well, today we are looking from HIPC to HIMC, and that's what we are going to discuss. There's so many numbers that is just confusing the layman, and we all want these numbers to be clarified so we know how much to contribute to get this country going. Now, according to financial experts or gurus, if your debt to GDP ratio hits 70%, then you're classified as being dangerously indebted, or a highly poor country, or maybe you might not be able to service your debt. So on Monday, Bank of Ghana comes up and says, well, we have hit the threshold where we now owe about 70% or just over 70% of our GDP. But then miraculously, the finance ministry comes up and says, no, hold on, you're working with the wrong figures. Now that sends the laymen very, very confusing that how will the central bank have different figures to the finance ministry? Are they working differently? Wouldn't they work in tandem to come up with a figure? And indeed, if the CD, if our debt has now reduced as per the finance ministry saying, because the CD appreciated by which percent? And is it sustainable? As soon as the CD drop, is this debt going to rise again, or what then happens? Folks, with me in the studio is Dr. Godfred Bokwin, Head of Finance, University of Ghana. He understands these things, and it's going to be an education. I'm just going to ask all these layman questions, and he's going to educate us. Doctor, you're welcome.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. I hope you're not as confused as I am, but just to get the conversation rolling, let's just hear what the Finance Ministry said, and then we base our conversation on that. So, stage.
The debt in dollar terms at the end of 2014, 24 billion, 24.6 billion. At the end of July, it is 24.4 billion. In between, it went down to 23 billion. So it's not true that we've been adding to debt, and a lot of this is on account of disbursement. However, when you apply the exchange rates in relation to the GDP, is sluggish, has been sluggish over the last 2 years. Then it is true at the end of June, the figure which is being quoted widely at 70, and which for the local media is raising a panic as we getting close to HIPC, hit 71. But if you take end of July, on account of the strengthening of the cedi, it is 62%. So you can see the drop from 71 to 62. So end of July, Bank of Ghana used the mid-year figures, and that's what's on their website, because they want the uniformity. So the stability of the exchange rate is very important.
Bank of Ghana used the mid-year figures and not the current figures, which is on their website. Is it a normal practice, Doctor?
I think that a point of disagreement can be accommodated in terms of which particular rates any of them chooses to use. I mean, people can even use the average for the year. Others can also use, perhaps, I want to understand it from the point that maybe the Ministry of Finance is using the one that is more favorable in terms of, because the goal is to reduce our debt to GDP ratio. So perhaps you want to use the rate that lowers your debt to GDP ratio, especially when the motive is to respond to a seemingly panic behavior that perhaps Bank of Ghana's report seems to have created. So we can accommodate that. But at the end of the day, you also want to look at that realistically, whether that is a true reflection of the performance of the economy, especially in terms of your debt buildup. If you just use a particular rate or a particular amount because the CD just appreciated, and if that is not representative of perhaps what has happened in the first 8 months of the year, then it means that perhaps people could raise certain issues. But that is not to suggest that it cannot be done.
Okay. Let me welcome to the show Dr. Gachi, who's also an economist. Dr. Gachi, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you've heard the goings. You know, we were almost HIMC, and then a statement came out which just drops us from 72 to 62, 71.32 to 62.38. Now, from a layman's point of view, I was wondering where the disparities came from, because I would assume that for Bank of Ghana to come up with these figures, there should be somebody from the Ministry of Finance, you know, also agreeing or working together, or is that too much of a layman's idea?
Well, I don't think so. I think the Bank of Ghana reviews the economy and give us the direction of policy rate, I think every 3 months. So the period that they were considering in order to decide, I think ends at June. So I do not think that there is any deceit or there is any problem between the Bank of Ghana and Ministry of Finance. It is the period difference as a result of what the Bank of Ghana is supposed to do over that period.
Well, so how would the policy work there? Because the Bank of Ghana is working up to June, and according to their books, according to you, economist and finance guru, I mean, 71.32 makes you, you know, dangerously indebted. So they will be making policies based on the fact that, listen, we are dangerously indebted. Indeed, if you're going to go and get this Euro bond and you present a form saying that I am 71.3, you know, for 32, the rates they give you will be different than if you present one that says you are 62.38. So, I mean, how are we working on this?
Well, I think the way I want to look at this thing is to fair any motive in what has happened. The point is that the level of our debt has gone beyond what is acclaimed to be the international sustainability ratio of 60% of your debt to GDP. When you get to that point, it starts putting some pressure on the economy in terms of the effect of your repayment cost, especially when we are talking about foreign currency denominated debt. That will also have some effect on your currency. That may have fuel some level of inflation, and you will start experiencing a better part of your revenue may be going into paying debt, and less will be left for other investment purposes. So those are the main things that I think confront the nation that we need to focus on. Because as for debt, the level of the debt, we have seen some countries whose level of debt to GDP is much more higher than that of Ghana. There's no description about whether they are getting to HIPC or they are not getting to HIPC, because that issue does not arise. Because the issue about HIPC itself is about you not being in position to make you meet your repayment obligation over a period of time, and that has other implications for you, and somebody is providing some funds to relieve you, but you need to meet certain criteria to be able to access those incentives that they are providing for you. So I don't want to go into this discussion about HIPC because we do not get to that point at all. But the important thing is that we have high debt. The effect that it's having on the economy is very apparent to everybody. So what the finance ministry has done is to provide the current data, especially at the end of July. You know, it was that period that we have significant appreciation of the currency from 4.3 look at volume,
I missed you there. From 4.3 to where?
For cities, 30% to $1. And all of a sudden, within 2 weeks, it fell to around 3 cities to the dollar.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the volume of money we are talking about, that will lead to a significant drop.
Okay.
I believe that is what has happened. I have met people who were crying during that period to the extent that within 2 weeks, some people were losing in excess of 70 million because of that sharp drop. So it is not strange at all to have that experience within that 1 month. So for me, it is not strange at all. And that should also tell us that if we're talking about proper debt management in the country, it does not depend on only the level of the debt, but it depends on 2 important factors. The growth of the economy, because if you're talking about debt sustainability, normally we are comparing the level of the debt to the GDP. So if the GDP is not growing significantly, that will itself undermine debt sustainability. And beyond that, if you're not able to have a control over the direction of your currency, that will also contribute to the problems of the debt. So that is what I think I want to say for now. Okay,
John, let me put one question to you and then I'll come to your brother in the studio. I have with me in the studio Dr. Godfred Bokpin, who's at Head of Finance at University of Ghana.
Yeah, my regards to him.
Good. With regards to other countries who may owe more than 70, you tend to find that these countries have also borrowed money out, and sometimes they have lots of assets to balance the economy, so they have the ability to borrow more because they've also lent out money.
I think you have raised an important point. So that is what I think Ghanaians should be focusing on, because beyond the debt to GDP ratio, you will need to look at the debt servicing cost to export revenue. You need to look at the debt servicing cost to GDP itself. You need to look at your expenditure on poverty alleviation, social intervention, things that affect ordinary people to GDP. Perhaps if we look at these things, they may not look better than the debt to GDP ratio. So that calls for how we can expand our export base so that when we compare our debt, assuming that we want to raise revenue from export to pay our debt, are we going to be in position to do that?
Okay, hold on for me, John. Let me come to the. If you land on your points, let me come into the studio and speak to Dr. Bok. Yeah. Okay, let me come to you. John was making a point that the CD appreciated, where one CD gave you 4.3, $1 gave you 4.3 CDs, and then it dropped down to $1 giving you 3 CDs. Obviously, if you multiply this 1.7 CDs by all these billions, it's a huge amount of money. Now, how much CDs did we put in the system to be able to get to this? And then if you multiply the amount of CDs we put to how much debt we owe less, how are we balancing it? For the layman.
Yes, I think that if you look at our public debt, component of it is internal, CD denominated.
Sure.
And then another component is external. So at the end of the day, you want to be able to look at the CD value of the external component. That is where the exchange rate becomes very important. So I agree with what my colleague said, that yes, the success of the debt management strategy also depends on exchange rates, because especially you are talking about external components. Beyond that, you are also exposed if your foreign earnings does not align very well with your external debt or your foreign debt, then it means that debt servicing becomes a problem as well as a repayment. So there's an issue there. But I also want to look at it from this point that just the debt to GDP ratio in itself may not mean much, because essentially that is a measure of debt burden that says that how hard would it be if we had to pay off all of our debt with 1 year's output. But there's no requirement really to pay off all our public debt with 1 year's income. But we borrow against future cash flow. That is where the issue is. So if we borrow against future cash flow and you realize that your economy is actually contracting at a time when your debt stock is also increasing, then it means that there is an issue that you have to be concerned about, because this has to be repaid. But the economy is not generating sufficient cash flow to be able to what? To contain the debt in terms of debt servicing as well as what? Repayment of the principal. And that is where the issue is. So for an economy that was growing at 11-point-something% in 2011, back to let's say 4.1%, and this year we predicted or we projected 3.7%, that was further reduced to 3.5%. So look at that reduction of GDP. That's significant enough. So your economy is actually contracting at a time when you have the numerator as the public debt, which is also increasing, and you have to pay. So there are indicators of debt sustainability in the literature. We may be doing well for some of them. Maybe if we look at the present value of the debt relative to the GDP, and then we also look at maybe the present value of the debt relative to our export value. We can also look at maybe debt service to revenue ratio. So let's even pick debt servicing to revenue ratio. If you look at the 2015 budget, for every CD revenue that we are able to generate as a country, almost 25 pesos goes into just debt servicing. So if you spend 25 pesos of every CD that you're able to generate on debt servicing, and let's say you spend another component, let's say 45% on wages and salaries, the two put together is almost 70%. Okay, so it means that you have flexibility of just 30 pesos. What can you do? So if you look at the 2015 budget, how much we actually allocated as a percentage of GDP to service our debt is actually more than how much we allocated for capital expenditure. And once you do that, it tells you that you are not really preparing for tomorrow. Because to be able to take advantage of tomorrow, you have to be able to invest today, especially in infrastructure, both social infrastructure and then economic infrastructure that actually links individuals and firms to economic opportunities and acts as a catalyst for economic growth. But see, as a country, we have a huge infrastructure deficit, and yet we have very limited borrowing space now because of where our debt to GDP ratio is now. But there's history to it. In 2000, our debt to GDP ratio was more than 100%. So automatically we qualified when the World Bank and the IMF brought this HIPC initiative. So we went for HIPC and then had the HIPC relief, I think somewhere up to 2004. And then in 2006 or so, we also benefited from the multilateral debt relief, essentially from the International Development Associations, the African Development Bank. So when we went through that process, our debt to GDP ratio came to about 26%. Okay, so from that time, and after rebasing, our debt to GDP ratio was less than 40%. So just look at that, let's say from January 2009 up to today, you see how fast we have climbed up. But that wouldn't be so worrying if we have a lot to show for it. If you borrow for productive purposes, then it means that the economy will be able to generate sufficient cash flow to be able to contain that. So like you said, and I agree with him also, countries have more than 70%, but really, if we point them to their public debt, they will point you to good infrastructure. They will point you into productive assets that backs that particular debt. So when it comes to debt servicing, they are within a tolerable level. When it comes to repayment, they are not worried. But we are increasingly worried because we are almost in the high risk debt distress category. Okay, that in itself tells you how challenging it will be to be able to service our debt without compromising on priority spending on infrastructure, because we have a huge infrastructure deficit that in itself is acting as a restriction on the growth drivers of the economy, for which reason the economy is unable to grow, especially along the lines that are that can absorb labor. You understand that? So if you talk about industry today and you look at the challenges, you could see the lack of investment in those areas is actually inhibiting the ability of industries to be able to grow. So once industries are becoming more uncompetitive, then it means that nobody will set up a productive function if they think that they cannot compete with imported items. So ideally, when the cedi depreciates, we should be rejoicing to some extent, because it means that the value of imported items will become expensive. Then you and I, as rational economic agents or people in the economy, should switch from imported items to what? To local. But that switching does not depend only on exchange rates. You have to be able to put the right structures in place and make the real sector of the economy that vibrant.
Let me bring John in here. John, we've heard of smart borrowing, and your brother here is making a point where he's saying that, look, other countries can point to, if you tell them they owe, and all the time, I think America is always the yardstick. Oh, even America, they borrowed from China.
Even Japan owes a lot.
You know, but they always have an automobile industry, they have that industry, and they are still pushing the trillions and trillions of GDP every year. Now, so our smart borrowing, I mean, of course, I've seen hospitals being built, I've seen roads being built. Is it that, they are going to generate money at a longer term? It doesn't seem to be generating money. I mean, you are the economist. What's happening?
Well, I think what is confronting the country is that we have deficit in terms of social infrastructure, and we have also very huge deficit with respect to economic infrastructure.
No, John, hold on. What I'm saying is that we owe 95 billion. Okay, no, now we owe 83 billion. The average Ghanaian will say, who cried on this high yet? Why? Because people are still queuing up for jobs. Doctors are striking. Everybody is complaining about one hardship or the other. So then you come to ask the state that, point a finger to what's happening. I'm saying I've seen lots of roads being done. I've seen hospitals coming up. But maybe are the monies being put in areas where they don't seem to return back so that we can go and pay the loans off?
I think when it comes to public expenditure, you do not treat it like a corporate finance issue. You will realize that constructing roads, hospitals, schools, they are equally very important for nation building. The only difficulty is that such investments will not repay by themselves. You are actually borrowing to put those infrastructure by collateralizing future able to raise in more tax revenue in the future, then your ability to repay becomes a problem. That is the situation we find ourselves. So we borrow, we put social infrastructure. Within the short to medium term, we cannot raise money from those infrastructure to repay. So there is now the need to restructure how we are going to borrow, what type of infrastructure we should use our borrows fund to engage in, and what will be the structure of the repayment as we go forward. It is only then that we can overcome some of these problems that we are facing. I do agree that when we borrow, we must be accountable as to the assets that have been generated from the borrowing. We can see a lot of assets that have been generated from the borrowing over time in this country. It is true that we have not deepened our industrial sector to allow for absorption of labor as we all wish. But as we speak, some of these same things that we find in our country is also seen in some countries, except that in our country we don't have data to even tell ourselves the real unemployment figure, how many people are absorbed within the first quarter, second quarter. We don't have those data. But if you follow the data for these countries that we are talking about, unemployment is very high in most of this country. So if we look at unemployment alone, we will not see the contribution of debt capital in contributing to asset build-up of the country. I think that significant assets have been generated as a result of borrowing, but we need to now look at how that borrowing is invested in terms of the generation of assets for the country.
Okay, John, I need to take a break here, and then when I come back, I want to follow up on I want to find out from the same question again. Yes, I'm not against hospital or schools or anything being built, but I mean, from again a layman point of view, would you borrow, let's say, put it in a refinery and then use the profit from the refinery then to build the road so you're not stuck up, or or something like that? And then the other thing I want to find out is, even our 3.5% growth in GDP, how much of it is due to indigenous businesses? Because I know there are other foreign,
the sector that is contributing to that growth.
So how much of this 3% is even ours to pay back our loan? And we'll find out if our experts will be able to tell us. Don't move on, coming back. Hello, and thank you very much for staying. And we are discussing HIPC to HIMC. Now, this conversation, I would plead of Aisha so that we continue, because I don't think we can do it in 1 hour. 1 hour is just to set the basis, and then the next hour, the next day, we can actually delve into details. But have I got John Kachi still on the phone?
Yes, I'm here.
John, I wanted to reiterate about us borrowing and building, and I'm seeing, things growing, hospitals coming up, schools coming up, but somehow the finance minister is not getting the returns to go and pay. And I'm saying, as a layman, should we, borrow the money and put it in a business and use the profit rather?
As I stated earlier on, that is not how you will manage the public finance. Because, take for example, you take huge sum of money to put up refinery, power plants, etc. So you have efficiency at the energy sector, which is very sensitive to the economy. But at the same time, people are traveling miles before they attend to standard hospital. You must bear in mind that the economy is not defined only in terms of how you can repay.
So you've made your pen there. You've obviously made your pen there, which I understand. So what is happening to us then? Why can't we just manage our debt, and why can't we pay back?
Oh, as I indicated earlier on, and I think Godfrey also indicated, you see, the way you structure all these things depends on how you are also mobilizing revenue. The reason why you are even going for the debt is because you are not able to mobilize enough revenue. So if we are able to mobilize the needed revenue internally, that we can use to engage in some of these social projects, so that when we go in for long-term loans, we can direct these long-term loans to specific revenue projects. By that, I mean projects that we know they're economic in nature and they can pay for themselves with time. That is how you will be able to overcome this problem. Without that, it will be very difficult to overcome this problem.
John, thank you very much. Let me end with you here, but thanks for your insight. Let me now welcome Kweku Kwating, who is a member of Parliament and also the Finance Committee in Parliament. Kweku, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Kweku, let me start with you from where John ended, that the reasons why we are going for the loans is because we won't be able to mobilize the funds. That's why we're going. But then if you can't mobilize it, then how are you going to pay for it, and if you're going for the loans?
Yeah, that is precisely the point. And my own worry with the kind of borrowing we are seeing now, that would repay themselves. That's commonsensical, isn't it? That you borrow, you put it in an investment, that investment would generate money and then repay the loan, so that when you have finished repaying the loan, at least what you get from the investment can go to support your resource envelope. When you have a situation where you are just borrowing to survive, that the Bank of Ghana, the government goes to the Bank of Ghana and borrows in short-term instruments, T-bills and short-term bonds. And then when it is time to pay, government says, I can't find the money. So government then goes to borrow substantially, somewhat long-term to medium-term, and uses the money to finance the short-term instruments. What you're doing essentially is that you are borrowing to survive. And then the question comes, how are you going to repay? For how long is this going to happen? And if you look at the last 6 years, if you look at how much we are borrowing and how much we are putting into capital expenditure, in total, you are around less than 40% of the money we are borrowing going into capital expenditure. And indeed, some of these capital expenditures are expenditures such as roads that by now have started deteriorating, and yet we are not repaying the loan. So I just don't see the strategy here. It seems to me that things have gotten out of government's control, and government is just saying that, look, I need money so badly that I would go and borrow to finance my recurrent expenditure now. As to how I would repay, that is something I'll think about in the future. That appears to be the attitude of government, and I'm saying we can never continue going on like that.
But let me come in here, because, if I had a government representative in the studio, he would draw out his paper and start giving you the list. Police Hospital, Ridge Hospital, Legon Hospital, the Eastern Corridor Road, and there was the desalination water at Teshi. They will give you all this list of things which are going. So then, what more can they do?
Well, it is very easy to look around and to say, to point to some of these specific projects. But government itself summarizes the capital expenditures and borrowed money in its annual. And look, in 2012, we borrowed 9.5 billion in 2012. At the beginning of 2012, we were owing 33.5 billion. At the beginning, we were owing 24 billion. By the close of 2012, it was 33.5 billion. Now you look at the difference, and the borrowing is about 9.5 billion. Now, how much did we put into capital expenditure? 4.9 billion capital expenditure. There's a difference of 4.53 billion that went into recurrent expenditure. In 2013, we borrowed a total of 18.4 billion. Only 3.47 billion of that went into capital expenditure. And I'm taking these figures from government's own budget statement. The difference is 14.93 billion. So of the 18.4 billion that we borrowed, 14.93 billion went into recurrent expenditure. 2014, we borrowed 24.2 billion. Capital expenditure got only 5.47 billion. Now, what we're seeing is that a large part of this borrowing is going into recurrent expenditure.
Wow.
And I think the worry of everybody now is that how then are you going to repay if you're just borrowing to consume? And why are we doing that? That perhaps is taking us into going forward. What do we do? Why have we had to borrow in order to survive? It is because government expenditure now, public sector expenditure now, is far bigger than the resources we are able to raise. And it has become almost an entrenched feature of our economic management. So the solution from government end then is to borrow to make up the difference. I think we have come to a point where government has to do two things. One, have a fair idea what a portion of that money goes into, the corruption and the waste. We need to show clearly how we're going to deal with that matter. 2, we need to do the public sector reforms. If your public sector is so big, your manufacturing sector so weak, so the money you are able to raise is so small, and therefore money for even buying chalk is now a problem. Money to fix the macroeconomic environment, like the powers for businesses, government has now, the Bank of Ghana has now increased its policy rate. What it means is that business is now going to borrow at more expensive rate. The result is that those businesses that you expect to expand their economic activity and contribute to the revenue that will solve your problem are being made worse off.
Kwaku, round it up for me here.
So my conclusion then is that the strategy going forward is doomed. You don't need anybody to tell you this, that if you borrow to survive, you are heading for trouble. We need to announce, government needs to announce to the people of this country that this is a problem we all understand. What are the government strategies to deal with it? The increasing public sector expenditure as against our revenue. Government should not just borrow. Government should tell us that, look, in the medium term, this is how I intend to fix the problem, so that we know where austerity measures will come from. We know we can prepare. But the current strategy, where we are so desperate that you just let's borrow and survive, would just lead us into a ditch, and that's my worry.
Thank you very much there. Let me come to studio and talk to Dr. Godfrey Bokpin, who's been patiently listening and analyzing, and your brothers have all come up with issues. But let me start with that 3.5% growth. You actually raised it. And what comes to mind is, look, you tend to find out that all the major parts of this economy, the mines, the telecom, the oil, a great percentage of that, it's owned by foreigners who take their capital and their profit away anyway. So how does that affect us?
Yeah, really the issue is not about the identity of the owners, because we are using GDP. And GDP doesn't distinguish between foreigners. It's about outputs. So at the end of the day, whatever they also produce and all of that, because they also employ...
Also, whatever is left of what they produce...
whatever they produce is captured in our GDP, because we are not talking about GNP, gross national product. It's just gross domestic product. So really, because the point is that they pay their taxes, they employ Ghanaians, they are also contributing to GDP in a number of ways. But I think that in addition to what my senior colleagues have all raised, which I think that there is no scarcity of solution to really our problem. It's about the will to do. The will to do and get it done. But in addition to that, we're also talking about maybe exploring efficiencies in our public investments that we do. We go for these loans and we are unable to generate a much needed return because the level of inefficiency in public investment is very high. In fact, I'm not saying this because it's a study that has been done by the IMF and then other organizations. It's almost 30%. Okay, so of whatever you spend, 30% of that is attributed to inefficiency. So, yeah, in the long run, you will realize that you would have spent that money, but you wouldn't be able to generate how much that you should. And the fact that you also invest in social infrastructure is not detrimental to the economy. You understand that? Because a healthy workforce is a great asset. I mean, if you invest in education, it's an asset and all of that. But like he said, we go for these loans, but the bigger portion of those loans really don't go into the productive aspects of the economy that should actually generate the much needed cash flow because of the imbalances in the system, because the economy is not generating that much, and yet your expenditure is way up there. I mean, you and I slept one day and woke up and we became rich all of a sudden because we used a different calculator, call it rebasing. Right, but that didn't come with increase in cash flows necessarily in your pockets. Okay, so that meant that we were lower middle income country. So our tax efforts should be more than 20%. Our tax effort here, we are talking about the total revenue we are able to generate as a country. Scale that by GDP. So whilst in other countries they are doing 25 and above, our tax effort is less than 18%. Okay, whilst our expenditure is way up there. And that in itself tells you that we are unable to generate enough to be able to maybe cover expenditure, recurrent expenditure, and have enough for let's say capital expenditure. And that is why you will not blame government necessarily for making a higher provision for debt service and compared to capital expenditure, because they are mirroring the reality, because we have borrowed and we need to service our debt. Yeah.
Let me divert a bit, even though I'm saying, I mean, how much has free market, contributed to this? To this? I mean, is our
in terms of allowing foreigners...
I mean, is our market not too free?
We have liberalized, and some people are concerned that we have over-liberalized. But I think that at the end of the day, you also need regulation to be able to ensure that the liberalization works very well. Because ideally, there's nothing wrong if other people bring their capital in, invest, you understand, because they're also contributing to the economy. And then, but of course, they have to generate some return and then also move it forward. But in this country, we put premium on foreign investments relative to local investments. Okay, our laws and our systems and our attitudes are structured in such a way that we tend to welcome what is from outside more than maybe what is from here. And I think that in itself is not good. But really, if you have to borrow domestically, and you have to borrow at the rate of, let's say, 35%, certainly you will not be competitive. You won't be. The type of credit that we have in this country does not support production. Okay, the average maturity of credit in the system is about 12 months. Okay, but the average turnaround in the manufacturing sector is probably 2 to 3 years. So it means that the type of credit that we have does not support production. It only supports something, import. Because within 6 months, you're able to turn it around. You understand that? And once all that you do is to import, you're only working hard to put money in the pocket of those who are producing. Okay, because we are not producing anything. So you understand? And the reason we are not producing anything, you can trace it to systematic failures in the agric sector that should also feed industry. So agric is not doing that much well. Okay, and that is where the CD itself. Okay, so when you see a big appreciation, then you can tell from day one that it's not sustainable, because if that appreciation is not supported by the political and economic fundamentals of the economy, then you know it's not sustainable.
So then, I mean, would the finance ministry have been fairer if they took the average conversion rate to calculate how much we owe, rather than that 2 weeks where the money was at its lowest? Because you and I know it's not going to stay. I mean, it's not even 3 cities anymore.
Yeah, so if it's more than that now, it means that our debt to GDP ratio is not exactly what they've given us. Okay, so I mean, the literature supports using an average for maybe for the period, average for the year, and all of that. But there's nothing to also suggest that what they have also done is entirely wrong. Is that okay? But ideally, if you do that positional measure, okay, and the rate changes just after that, it means that whatever information you put out there perhaps will not last for that much. And you see what we have also done, we have waited for the central bank to bring this news to the economy or to the investing community. And
shut
now
up their confidence.
Yeah, and now you are doing more or less like a damage control, that look, really, this is it, and all of that. But it's going to, because negative news exerts greater impacts on people's confidence sometimes than positive news of the same magnitude. So I think it's important that we maybe take a second look. But I can also understand that the ministry would also have to allay the fears of Ghanaians that we are not in excess of 70%.
Let me take a break here. When I come back, the conversation continues from HIPC to HIMC. Well, thank you very much for staying. A very, very interesting subject. We're trying to break it down to the layman level. What we're trying to say that any countries whose debt to GDP rises to 70% or over, it means that you are dangerously in debt. So Bank of Ghana releases a statement to say, look, we've crossed the threshold as of June. Then the finance ministry comes and no, as of July, we went back into the threshold. Why? Because the cedi appreciated. And somewhere in July, the cedi went to about 3 cedis. Now, you and I know that it doesn't stay there. So we asked them, what then happens? So by next month, we go back into, being supposedly HIMC, or are we going to try and maintain our 3 cedis? But, Doc, I mean, what's the bigger picture? What should, and who first of all, who takes the lead? Is it the central bank, or is it the finance ministry? Who takes the lead in making those hard decisions to say, look, this ABCD we need to do to start lowering this debt?
So we can look at the factors that contribute to the higher debt to GDP ratio.
Okay, and then
one, fiscal deficit. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not the central bank that controls that. It's government. So Ministry of Finance. So because fiscal unsustainability is linked to debt unsustainability, because the fiscal deficit is an indication of the borrowing requirement of what? Of government. Though in principle there's nothing wrong with borrowing. If we borrow and it's not for productive purposes at this stage, that we have limited borrowing space, then it means that we'll be heading dangerously with any addition to the our debt to GDP ratio. Then we also have to look at maybe economic growth, which is not easily controllable, okay, because so many factors and all of that. So once the economy is not growing, then it means that you cannot generate the sufficient cash flow to be able to service your debt. Then that also means that your borrowing appetite will remain highly elevated, because your revenue envelope will remain dwarfed because the economy is not growing. And we are talking about all these things at a time when we are going through load shedding in this country. You understand that? I mean, and firms are laying off workers. It's not like it only affects only the individual. It also affects government revenue envelope in terms of income taxes. You understand that? And it's also consumption, because they are now going to consume less. And you know VAT is also a consumption tax and all of that. So really we have to work hard, and the way to do it is to be able to lift those restrictions on the growth drivers of the economy, especially energy. How are we going to solve it? We've had several deadlines. We can bear with government the challenges and all of that, but for how long? For how long? Okay, and once you are doing that, okay, we are losing the local market share to foreign products. And once you lose that, you can't easily regain it when the power is back, okay? And how much this energy crisis, this darkness, how much money this darkness has put in the pocket of some foreign companies is significant. Because every day we are importing all kinds of energy-related items from China, from all over the place. You understand that? And people are spending hugely on fuel, just to fuel their plant and all of that. It is possible students' performance could be affected because they don't have light. And I can't just imagine how they won't have light to study, but then they will have light to write exams. What are they going to write? Because at the time they needed light to prepare, there was no light. So if all that they could have was light to go and write the exam. So in terms of even all of that could be affected. So, but we're also looking at maybe infrastructure. Look at the trouble people have to go through just to go to work, the traffic and all of that. Maybe after a while, we'll begin to see the health impact of those traffics, what people have to go through just to meet their targets. They are giving up help, they are giving up family, they are giving up so many things just to meet that. For how long? Okay, and that also tells you that once you see that huge infrastructure deficit, the extent to which we're able to connect labor and other factors of production, I mean, the time lag is very, very long. And all of that put together makes our firms uncompetitive in a globalized economy. That is why you realize that instead of people even manufacturing, they will prefer to import the item and only put a local logo on it. Because if they decide to produce here, the average cost will be very, very high. Okay, so once you see these things consistently, then it tells you that, no, certainly you are going to have problems with your debt sustainability.
Doctor, so should we start maybe sector by sector, or it's not impossible, you have to do the whole thing?
They are linked. You just come out with one strategy and say we are going to transform industry. That same strategy must look at agriculture. That same strategy must look at infrastructure, road networks, okay, power supply, water supply, education, okay, health. Because you can't avoid social spending or social infrastructure, because a healthy workforce is an asset. Okay, so just one policy. So it's not like, okay, let's just take this. Okay, we have to have an integrated approach that seeks to address, I mean, the challenges that we have today. Maybe looking at where we have comparative advantage. But today, you can't only talk about comparative advantage. You have to back that with competitive advantage. So where do we have comparative advantage? So that we can guarantee competitive advantage along those lines. So that even if we say that we are transforming agriculture, because that also employs a lot of labor, okay, that in itself could also even help the city to breathe well. Because we are importing all kinds of things that we could produce here. Okay, yeah.
I mean, Doc, in 30 seconds, and I'm making you the finance minister. I'm giving you lots and lots of powers. What are the first things that you're going to slash? Because this we've gotten to the slashing stage.
Certainly.
Yeah. So
some rationalization would certainly have to take place.
So
and we have to be bold. There are some things we need to go and treat it with hammer. And we must be prepared.
Which one will be the first or the next?
I think that we have to look at the size of government.
We could downsize.
It is possible in challenging times, so that maybe when things get well, we get back. Because it happens. Corporate restructure. Others give up their bonuses, their allowances, just because they want to bear with the system. Okay. And if once we do that, it should be able to extend that to other public sector workers as well, because we are getting to a point where we look at the wage bill and all of that and see what is it that we all, what sacrifices that we all have to make. It is not fair enough to only say that only you give up your allowance, like say, and then I keep mine or something. There are some trade-offs that we all have to do collectively. Leadership is important. You can see majority of our problems maybe through the eye of leadership. Okay, Doc, we need that.
Thank you very, very, very much. Dr. Bokbin, Head of Finance, University of Ghana. I want to say thank you to Tanti's Fashion, who makes my shirts. And it's 024-366-2001. 024-366-2001. Give them a call, get one shirt. Thank you to Aisha Ibrahim, to Azalu and Evans Benza, to Malik Dabu and Ni, all for doing production. Tomorrow we'll be back to do this all over again, but good news, we are not HIMC.